and in this module, we're going to look at using models and view models. So far in this course, we have seen that when a user opens a browser and sends an HTTP request to our application, that the MVC framework is going to use routing rules to try to route that request to a specific controller. That controller is then going to build a model, and then that controller is going to select a view to render that model. It's going to pass the model along, and the view is going to produce HTML. So what's the difference between a model and a view model? Well, a view model is a concept that I like to talk about. A view model is a model or a class that you have built whose only purpose, whose only responsibility is to encapsulate and carry all the information that is needed to render a view. In other words, some of the models that might exist in our application serve dual purposes. Let me give you an example by flipping over into our application. Let's go over into the Data project and let's pull up the restaurant model. So yes, we can say that restaurant is a model. It's a relatively simple model, but it's a model nonetheless. But many people would actually call this restaurant class an entity. Restaurant is an entity because it represents the information that's going to be persisted into a database. And later in this course, we're going to be using a framework called the Entity Framework to store and retrieve restaurant information into a SQL Server database. So restaurant is a model. I could also consider it an entity, but it's definitely a model, and I can use it as a model because we've already seen in the restaurant's controller when someone is trying to find the details for a specific restaurant. The exact model that I build and pass over to a view is a single restaurant. But what I want to make you aware of is the fact that entities don't always make the best models for a view, because quite often a view will need more information than you can have from a single entity, like restaurant. And in those situations, quite often I like to build what's known as a view model, whose only responsibility is to provide all the information and behavior that is needed for one specific view. So a good example of that would be the greeting view model. This is not information that I persist in the database. This is all the information that I need for a specific view that the user is trying to see when they reach the greeting controller. And there's nothing that says I couldn't do something like include a property, which would include a list of the restaurants that I know about. So let's create a property named restaurants. All I need to do is make sure I spell restaurant correctly and bring in the namespace Data.models. And I now have a view model designed for my greeting page that can not only display the current message of the day, but also contain a collection of entities, which are the restaurants that I know about in my database. Other pieces of information that a view model can carry along to a view might include lookup data. So let's say that we're going to edit a restaurant. When I go to edit a specific restaurant, like Mango Grove, I need more information for that particular view than just the data that is stored in the database. I need more information than just the name of the restaurant and the cuisine type. I need, for example, a list of all the available cuisines that a user can select from when they're editing that restaurant. We'll see that exact scenario in this module. And now that I've had the opportunity to tell you about the philosophical differences between a model and a view model, let's jump into a scenario where we're going to edit some restaurant data. Currently, in the application, if we go to localhost/restaurants, we'll end up on a list of all the restaurants that we know about. This is what we implemented in the last module. And we did that by scaffolding out this view, and the scaffolding included a link to create a new restaurant. This goes to /restaurant/create, but currently results in a 404 not found error because we have no action in our controller that can respond to an action name of create. So let's add one. Back in Visual Studio, I'm already inside of restaurantscontroller.cs. So let's create a new action that returns an action result. It's going to be named create. I don't need to take any parameters in this case. I don't need an ID because I'm going to create a restaurant out of thin air, or more precisely out of the information that a user gives to me, which means I don't even need to do any sort of data query either. Let's just see what happens if we just return a view that can create a restaurant. Once again, I'm going to use the Visual Studio scaffolding to create that view. So I can right-click inside of the method, say that I want to add a view. The view name is going to be create. The template, in this case, I'm going to select the create template, and the model class, once again, will be restaurant. And here again, I want to point out that if I have a view model, That is a class whose sole purpose is to carry along all the information that I need to create a restaurant. Really, the way to think about it in an edit scenario is this view model encapsulates all the information that needs to be exchanged during a particular operation, so not necessarily presented, because another use of a view model is to receive inputs from a user. So I can have a view model whose only responsibility is to receive the information that a user is going to type into a form. Because once again, quite often that information can be different than the information that I store in the database, which could be represented by an entity. In this case, we're going to use this restaurant class. So something that I use to carry along the data that I need to show when I display the details for a restaurant, as well as an input model. So something that I will use to collect information from the user before I store it in the database. So it's operating both as an input and an output model. But I still wouldn't necessarily consider restaurant a view model because that's not its only purpose in life. It's also an entity. And with that clarification, let me go ahead and click Add to scaffold out a create view. And now, just to test this out, let me do a build inside of my project and come back to the web browser. I want to refresh /restaurants/create. And I do have now a response that displays this view that allows me to enter a restaurant name and then click on a create button to save that restaurant. So once again, we're in a situation where the scaffolding didn't quite properly handle the enum property that we have on a restaurant, the cuisine type, which isn't a big problem. We can go in and add that by hand here in just a moment. But I do want to point out something a little more subtle that is presenting this create view. This action obviously isn't creating a restaurant. This action is responding to an HTTP GET request, and a GET request, by the way, will never or should never perform a write operation on my server. And essentially what this action is doing is responding to a request to get a form that will allow a user to create a restaurant. That's the way to think of this. I'm not actually creating a restaurant in this action. I'm giving you the HTML that you need to create that restaurant. When the user actually clicks on this create button, expecting to save that restaurant into the database, that's going to be another action that we have to create that will receive the restaurant information and then validate that information and save it in the database. We're not quite there yet. First, let's come back to the view that was created, the Razor view, the CSHTML file. And inside of here, you'll see a few more HTML helpers. Again, all HTML helpers are just here to help you emit snippets of HTML. So what does HTML.begin form do? HTML.begin form will render a form tag. By default, the method on this form will be a post method. And by default, the action on this form, which tells the browser where to post to, is going to be the same URL as where the form came from. So if this form is being delivered from a URL /restaurants/create, the default action when I click on a submit button inside of the form is to post back to /restaurants/create. That's what begin form is doing. There's also this little trick that is taking advantage of the C# using statement to close the form when we hit the bottom of this code block. So down here, by wrapping that in a using statement, when I close that using statement, close that block, that will essentially emit the /form closing form tag. So that's all that begin form is doing. Anti-forgery token is going to emit a hidden input into this form. We'll take a look at it in the browser in just a moment. But the value of this hidden input will be some cryptologically significant value that ASP.NET can use to ensure that the form the user is submitting is a form that came from your site and not some other malicious site that is trying to trick the user into submitting a form to your site. So an anti-forgery token, if you want to do more research on why this exists, is here to help us prevent cross-site request forgeries. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about cross-site request forgeries. But I do just want you to remember that anytime you're in a situation where you have users filling out forms, you should use anti-forgery tokens, especially if your application requires authentication and you use cookies or authentication ticket cookies to authenticate your users. In those scenarios, it is especially important to use an anti-forgery token. Now, many of these other HTML helpers, as we're going to see, emit little bits of HTML and help us implement everything that we need for this form. For example, what happens if there are validation errors on our model? Currently, we're not going to have any validation problems with our model because we're not performing any validation, but when we do later in this module, we'll see how HTML helpers that revolve around validation, like validation message 4, can automatically display validation messages for us. And those messages can be styled using Bootstrap styles to call out that something is an error or something is dangerous. So this @class syntax is a way to set a class attribute on a particular HTML element. So let's say that validation message 4 ultimately renders a span that says something like this name is required. That can be a validation error message that appears, but we want to style the text inside of the span to make sure it stands out. We essentially want to add a class of text-danger, which is a class that is included using the Bootstrap CSS framework. Again, not a topic I'll get into a lot in this course, but you can find plenty of courses on Bootstrap at Pluralsight. But my overall point here is that the syntax for doing that is the syntax you have here. Essentially, with many of these HTML helpers, you can pass along an anonymously typed object, and the Razor View Engine will take the properties on that anonymously typed object and write those properties out as HTML attributes. And then whatever value you have for that property will become the value of the attribute. The reason the @ sign is here is because in C# it is not legal to have a property name of just class. Class is a keyword. But the C# language also defines that if you use the @ sign, that's sort of like escaping that keyword. So yes, you can have a property named @class. And the Razor View Engine is smart enough to recognize that, oh, you want to write out a class attribute with this value. So that's what's happening here. Sometimes that parameter is explicitly specified as the HTML attributes parameter. So that's what's happening here with editor 4. What does editor 4 do? Editor 4, again, like all these other HTML helpers, will look at metadata about this particular property to try to figure out what is the best input to place into this form. So if you don't know anything about HTML forms and how forms and inputs and input type equals submit work, you might want to go through a bit of a refresher before you start down this path using Razor Views and HTML helpers. It will certainly give you a better idea of what's happening behind the scenes, but editor 4 will essentially create an input. So in this case, an input that the user can type into, and the type of this input could vary. So in this case, what the HTML helper editor 4 will do is look at name, see that it is a string property, and so the best type for this input is probably going to be the text type. Later in this module, I'll show you some of the data annotations that you can attach to a model so that editor 4 could see things like, oh, this is actually going to store a password, so maybe I should make the type password, or I will make the type password instead of text. But these are all things that the HTML helpers are doing. They are emitting all the markup that we need to not only edit specific pieces of a restaurant, but also to show labels for the user and to show validation messages when something goes wrong, which is good. But before we can have a complete form that allows me to create a restaurant, I'm going to need to do something that will allow me to edit the cuisine or specify the cuisine type of a restaurant. Let's add an input to our form that will allow a user to specify the cuisine for a restaurant before they create the restaurant. So back in our create view, which I do want to point out takes a model of type restaurant, we have all these HTML helpers like editor 4 that allow us to specify a property on that model type, and then just provide the right type of editor or provide the right type of display for a label that displays for that property. I want to do the same thing for the cuisine property, but the cuisine property is a little bit different just because it is an enum. What I'm going to do though is copy this form group, because basically every piece of information that the user needs to edit is going to follow this general pattern where I want a label and an editor inside of a form group, and I also want any potential validation messages that are associated with that particular property inside of that form group. So I'm going to copy this form group, and then we're just going to change things around so that instead of being a form group for the name of the restaurant, we're going to change these things around so this is for the cuisine of the restaurant. So this is going to write out an HTML label. The label for helper will look at the metadata for this cuisine property to determine what is the text that I should display to the user when they input this field. And yes, once again, we have some HTML attributes that will add classes of control label and column medium 2, both Bootstrap classes. This will add these class specifications to the HTML that is emitted. Then we have a div with a specific width that first of all has an editor for, in this case, I want to change this to cuisine. And then if there are any validation problems, I also want to display any validation messages that are associated with the cuisine. Let me save that Razor View file, the .cshtml file, and do a refresh out here. And what I now have is a textual input for the name of the restaurant as well as for the cuisine of the restaurant. But this might not be quite what I want because this is essentially a free-form text entry. And if I'm only expecting certain values for the cuisine type, then I really want to restrict the user to only being allowed to select one of the existing cuisine types that I know about. We'll talk about that in a second, but right now this is free-form text. How can I be sure about that? Because if I right-click on this input and say that I want to inspect this element, I will see that I have an input whose type equals text. So I can type anything into this input. I also just want to point out up here at the top, this is the form that was emitted by html.begin form. So notice the action is /restaurants/create because we came from /restaurants/create. If you want this form to post or to get to a different action, that is a different controller action, there are parameters that you can pass to html.begin form so that when the user clicks the submit button or this form is otherwise submitted, it will go to a different controller action. But for right now, by default, this is going to post back to the restaurant's controller to a create action, a new create action that we're going to have to add to the restaurant's controller. I'll show you how to do that in the next clip, but I do just want to point out the request verification token that is here. Again, that is here to help prevent a cross-site request forgery, which is something you always want to do. Let's see if there's something different that we can do for cuisine so that the user just doesn't type in whatever they want for the cuisine type. And it turns out there is a different HTML helper that I can use when I have a property of type enum. So first of all, there's lots of different HTML helpers inside of here. There's HTML helpers for validation messages, to create different types of inputs, to create a list box or a list of items, to explicitly create password inputs. And there is also one for creating a drop-down list based on an enum type. So enum drop-down list for. And by switching from editor for to enum drop-down list for, I should have a different display inside of my view. So now instead of saying I want some sort of editor for this particular property, I'm being a little more explicit and I'm saying I want a drop-down list, which behind the scenes is really an HTML select element, a select element with options that are built out of the values for this enum. So in most cases, you just want to use editor for when you want to provide an input for the user, but there are some special circumstances where you have to be a little more explicit, and in this case I have to be explicit and say I don't want just any editor, I specifically want a drop-down list. So if I do a refresh, I have essentially an HTML select. If we inspect this element, we'll see it's a select, and if I expand this, we'll see the options are all taken from the definition of my enum, and the values will match the matching enum entry. So Italian is 1, Indian is 2, French is 3, and although this drop-down list could probably do with a little bit of styling, a user can now safely select just one of the cuisines that I already expect. And now I could fill out a restaurant name and I could click create, and what's going to happen next? Well, currently in the application, nothing is going to happen because currently in the application, that form will send a request to /restaurants/create, will end up at this existing create action, but all this create action will do is re-render the view that the user can use to fill out this information. We're not actually going to save anything. We're going to need a different action for that. Let's talk about that in the next clip. What I'm about to show you is going to be a common pattern that you'll see when you're programming with the MVC framework. And that pattern is this. Anytime you're implementing a feature or a scenario where the user needs to edit data, you typically have a pair of controller actions that are required to implement that feature. The first controller action will be the controller action that gives the user the form that they fill out to edit or create a particular resource. And the second controller action will be the action that receives the information that the user has filled out. So in other words, I'm going to need a pair of create actions. One action that simply returns the view, which contains the form that the user can type into, and another action that receives the restaurant information back from the user. So this particular action can take a parameter of type restaurant. I do need to bring in the namespace of food.data.models, I can give this parameter the name restaurant. And what we're going to see with the MVC framework, just like we've seen before, anytime I have a parameter on an action method, the MVC framework is going to do everything in its power to try to populate that parameter for me. So we saw this when we implemented the details action, and I asked the MVC framework to provide me with an ID. The MVC framework could find the ID in the routing data from the URL. We also saw that earlier when we were toying with the greetings controller, and I passed a name in the query string. So the MVC framework was also able to find a name parameter to pass into an action method from the URL. This restaurant is going to be a little bit different, but the MVC framework is still smart enough to say, oh, you need an object of type restaurant. And I see that a restaurant has an ID property and a name property and a cuisine property. Let me go looking for something with those names anywhere inside of this request. And you have to remember the browser behavior. When I have a form like this and I fill out this information and I click on the create button, the browser is going to collect things like the inputs and the selects that are in this form and submit them to the server. And it's going to submit the values using the names that I specify for these selects and these inputs. In other words, if I have a select whose name is cuisine and whose value that the user selects is a 1 or a 2 or 3, then that is going to be one of the values that the browser submits to the application back to the server when it posts to /restaurants/create. So the MVC framework is going to be smart enough to say, oh, I see someone is posting a form value with a name of cuisine, and I see someone is posting a form value with a name of name. This input type equals text. So let me go ahead and create a restaurant object for you and just push those values into this restaurant. This is a process known as model binding in the MVC framework. With the values that I expect to receive from a user, and the MVC framework will automatically populate this object with values the user is entering in a form. We'll see how that works in just a second. Now, anytime I have a post operation, I want to make sure that I validate that anti-forgery token that is included in the form, especially, again, if I'm using authenticated users with cookies. I always want to validate that anti-forgery token, and I can do that here on the server side just by placing an attribute on my controller action. So I will validate the anti-forgery token. I will receive the user input into this restaurant object that the MVC framework will create for me using model binding. And now all I need to do is save that restaurant into my data source. We currently don't have a feature that will allow me to save a restaurant. So let's go into our interface for iRestaurant data. I'm going to create a very simple method named add that will take a restaurant parameter, and I expect anyone who implements this interface then to save that restaurant. So let's go to our in-memory restaurant data source. I'm just going to paste that method definition here, add a public access modifier. And now, how do I add a restaurant to an in-memory data source? Well, let me just simply walk up to our list of restaurants and use the add method to say I want to add this restaurant into the list. That's really all I need to do for in-memory data. But a couple things here. So first of all, remember this just is a list of restaurants in memory. Anytime my application resets or recycles, or if I close Visual Studio and come back tomorrow, any new restaurants that I've added to this list will be gone. They will have disappeared. We will fix that problem later when we actually hook up something that talks to SQL Server. But just be aware that while you're testing this application, you might do a build with some new code and all of a sudden you are missing some restaurants that you've typed in. That's just going to happen with the in-memory data service. One other thing to keep in mind is that when we start using SQL Server, we're going to be using SQL Server to generate IDs for our restaurants. So SQL Server has a feature where anytime I insert a new record into a table, SQL Server can generate a unique identifier for that particular record. We're going to rely on that feature to generate IDs for our restaurants. Our in-memory data, this list, has no such feature, but we still need these IDs in our application so that we can navigate to specific restaurants. So I need to generate an ID for this new restaurant that we're adding. And I'm just going to use some simple logic that will only work in this scenario where I'm running an in-memory list of restaurants and I'm doing that in development where there are no concurrent users. So obviously this would never work in production. None of this would ever work. Not if I have real users and simultaneous users. But for right now, I'm just going to say that this restaurant's ID property is going to be equal to, and let's go out and find the existing largest ID in our collection. So if I say restaurants.max, So it's the link max operator. Given a restaurant R, let's look at the ID property. Tell me what the maximum value is that you see, and then just add 1. That will be the ID for the new restaurant that is being added. And now I have a method that I can invoke to add a restaurant to my data source. So let's just do that here inside of create. I'm going to do the simplest possible thing that could work right now, which is just to walk up to my data source, say that I want to add a restaurant, and we're just going to leave everything in place. I'm going to do a build, and I'm going to come back to the browser, and we're about to find out that this doesn't quite work just yet, but I want to show you what happens. For the name of the restaurant, I'm just going to enter in Scott's Place because that's different than Scott's Pizza. Let's set the cuisine type to Indian. Let's click Create, and what I'm going to find is that the MVC framework isn't quite happy yet. So yes, the MVC framework can see that I want to go to the restaurant's controller. It can see that I want to find an action on that controller named create, but it sees 2 possible candidates for that action. So it sees these 2 create methods, and it's giving me an error saying it doesn't know which one to select. Well, you know, and I know that I expect this version of create to be invoked when I click on that create button in the form because I'm posting back to the server. And that post includes restaurant information, but the MVC framework's not going to make that guess. It's just going to throw an exception. I need to be a little bit more explicit and say this particular version of create should only respond to an HTTP post. So that's the big difference between these 2 action methods. This create method should only respond to an HTTP GET request because this is the action where I want to get the resource that will allow me to edit a restaurant, edit or create or type in the information. This version of create is where I'm writing or I'm posting those values to save them into the database. And really, only the HTTP post attribute is required because that would be enough to differentiate between this first create action and this create action. But a lot of people like to add these attributes everywhere so that it's very explicit that actions like details only respond to a GET request and actions like index, they will only respond to a GET request. And that's a reasonable thing to do. And now if I do a build, we should have something that's a little more functional. So let me go into the address bar and press enter. This should send off a GET request to /restaurants/create. So let's try filling out this form again. I'm going to fill out Scott's Place. I'm going to select a cuisine of Indian, click create, and what happens? Well, currently our controller is simply returning the create view when I post information to the server. That's not an ideal thing to do for many reasons. And I need to come up with a better user experience. We'll get there, but there's a couple things we need to work through before we come up with a better user experience. And for right now, I just want you to see that, yes, we're saying render the create view. So that's what we're seeing on this page. If I come to the list of restaurants, I can see Scott's Place actually was successfully added. But we did add this place without performing any validation on the model. So let's talk about some validations next. One of the problems with our new Create a Restaurant feature is that we perform no validation. So if I leave the name empty and click Create, we have now created a restaurant that has no name. Every restaurant should have a name, so we want to prevent that scenario. So back inside of Visual Studio, let's think about how to add some validation features. We want to have some validation features that will work with our view so that when there is a problem with the name, or there's a problem with the cuisine, or there's just some sort of general problem with the model, any validation or error messages that we have will work with these HTML helpers like validation message for and validation summary. And the way to make that work is to work with a data structure that is available inside of a controller known as model state. So model state is a property that you inherit in your controller. And anytime that you have model binding happening, like when you take a parameter of type restaurant, or even when you take a simple parameter of type int, like an ID, model state is going to contain information about what happened during that model binding. So if I go into model state, you'll notice it's a collection because really it's a model state dictionary. What I'm looking at is a data structure that contains all the byproducts of what happened during model binding. And I can go in and I can ask for specifically what happened when you tried to bind the name property to the restaurant. What is the underlying value that the user tried to enter, and what errors are associated with that specific field. And the HTML helpers in our create view are going to use this information in model state when they display that form, not only to show validation errors, so messages that would appear in this errors collection, but also when displaying the value that is inside the input for this associated property, like name. Because imagine I had a property that only allows integer values. So I want the user to enter the year the restaurant was created, for example, but the user enters the text XYZ and tries to place that into the integer property for the year. Well, obviously my model cannot accept that value. It cannot take an XYZ when it expects an integer, but the model state can represent the attempted value that the user tried to put in of XYZ. And so when I display this form back to the user to display the information that they entered along with the associated errors so they can now fix those values, I can display that value XYZ for the year property of a restaurant. So these are some of the things that model state will do for you. I can also explicitly tell model state about errors. So let's check if restaurant.name, let's check if it's null or empty. So if string.isNull or empty, restaurant name, then I know I have a validation error. So what I'm going to do is walk up to model state and say that I want to add a new model error. The key that I use to add this model error will be, for simple models, just the name of the property that has the error. So in this case, I'm just going to use a name of expression and say name of restaurant.name and specify an error message. The name is required. And then I can continue adding more validation checks here inside of my controller action. And ultimately what I want to do is I only want to add this restaurant to my data source if model state doesn't have any errors. And I can check for that by asking model state if everything is valid. So is valid only returns true if there are no model errors. So only if the model state is valid will we add the restaurant to the data source. Otherwise, what do? Well, in this case, let's return that create view because we want to present or represent the create view that the user is trying to enter this information into, present that form now with all the errors that are associated with the values they entered, and allow them to fix this problem. This other return view that we have here, we're going to change that in just a bit. I'm going to leave it here for now, because all I really want to show you is that now if I do a build in this application and I come out to the browser and I say I want to create a new restaurant, and then I just immediately click create without entering a restaurant name, I can now see the error message that says the name is required. So this is one approach to validation. I check my model values inside of my controller action. If I find any problems, I can add those validation errors into model state, and then when the create form displays or redisplays because I return that view, the HTML helpers like editor for and validation message for can look in model state to say, oh, I found a validation message for the name. I'm going to display that message inside of a span. And I wanted to show you this approach to validation because this is really what's happening behind the scenes. But of course, it would become tedious to go through my application and in every place where I might be editing restaurant data, I have to add these sorts of rules. Now, this is one way to do validation. It's a low-level attempted validation, but I do want you to know that the MVC framework provides some features to make validation a little bit easier than this. So some validation checks are so pervasive that they exist everywhere. So making sure that something isn't empty, making sure that numbers are in a specific range. If those are the types of validation checks that I'm making, there's an easier way to do that. Let me show you the approach next. Although what I'm showing you here is something you can do for validations. If all your validations are simple and common, like required fields and ranges, there is a better approach to validation. So I'm going to remove this validation logic check from inside of my controller action and instead introduce you to data annotations. Data annotations are pieces of metadata that you can attach to your models and your view models that can influence model validation during model binding, as well as how the HTML helpers present your information. So let's open up our restaurant model and come to the name, and I want to use a data annotation named required on this name. So if I press Control period, I can add a reference to the assembly that contains this particular annotation, that is the system.componentModel.dataAnnotations.dll, I'm going to add that, and that is also going to add a using statement for system.componentModel.data annotations. And now, anytime the MVC model binder runs validation logic across my model, if I'm using restaurant as an input model to an action, the MVC model binder will see this data annotation and will inspect the name property to make sure the name property is not null or empty. And if it is, the model binder will automatically set an error into model state to mark model state as invalid. So that logic I had in here before with the if statement is essentially taken care of for me by the default model binder in MVC. There's many other data annotations that you can add, and you can add them all inside of one pair of square brackets, or you can place them on separate lines inside of other square brackets. But some of the other annotations you'll see in that namespace include regular expression. So I can specify that the value of this property has to match this regular expression that I'm specifying in the data annotation. There is also, for number values, a range attribute, so I can say that something has to be between the value of 1 and 10, for example. And there's also data annotations that influence the display of a particular property or property value. A good example would be display format. In this case, I'm not adding a data annotation that drives validation logic in the MVC framework. I'm adding an annotation that adds that metadata that I've been talking about that things like HTML helpers can use. So notice with display format, I can specify a data format string. So if I have a property that is an integer or a property that is of type datetime, and I want to format the value when it displays in the browser in a particular way, I can set a data format string here. This uses all the regular formatting strings that you can find in .NET. I can also specify a null display text. So if something is null, like the restaurant name, but I don't want to try to display a null or empty value in my view, I could use null display text to change that. There's also data type. The data type annotation is useful when you want to specify something that might be just a plain type of string actually contains HTML or an image URL or a password. Because when you use something like html.editor4 to say, I want an editor for this particular field, if the MVC framework sees that that field is really of data type password, it can render an input type equals password. So when the user types into that input, we don't see the characters that they're typing. We see that masking character that browsers use, like the little dot that appears for each character when you're typing a password. There's also a display attribute. So I can say that the name of this particular property, when you're displaying a label, is not just the name of the property. That's what the MVC framework uses by default, cuisine. But I could come up with something different, like type of food. And if I do a build, let's come back to our application. And let's just go back to the list of all restaurants. Let's come into the create new form freshly. And you'll notice now, instead of displaying cuisine, it displays type of food. And the nice thing about these data annotations then is that it doesn't matter where I'm binding against a restaurant. I'm always going to have this validation to make sure that the restaurant name is in place. And I'm always going to have this metadata that says, don't just use the property name cuisine, display the text type of food. That's really the power of data annotations, to centralize that logic and centralize that metadata and use it to drive all these other features inside of the MVC framework. Now we have our validation logic in place, but there's still a problem with this form. It might not be obvious at first, but let's create another restaurant. And I will even name the restaurant another restaurant. We can set the type of food to Italian, click create, and again, the create action re-renders the create form, which doesn't really make sense for the user experience because to the user, to me, it looks like I have not completed this form as yet. So we have to do something different. And there's also a potential problem here. If I'm on this page now and I click refresh in the browser, well, every browser knows that it just completed an HTTP post action. So an HTTP post rendered this form. And every browser knows that refreshing a post or resending that post operation can create problems. I could be resubmitting a credit card order, so I could end up with a duplicate transaction. And because of that, Firefox is trying to tell me, I'm going to send information and repeat that action. Are you really sure that you want to do this? Do you want to resend this form? I'm going to cancel out of resending this information, and this is a user experience that we don't want to place our users into. We want to adopt a pattern known as the post redirect get pattern. Post redirect get says that when you do an HTTP post for a user like this, when they're posting a form and you successfully process that form, you don't want to display HTML that is a result of that post operation. Instead, you want to send a redirect instruction to the browser, tell it to redirect to another resource and go and get that other resource. That way, when the user successfully submits a restaurant, and I've saved that information in the database, I'll send their browser over to another resource that they get, and as long as that is a GET request, they can refresh that page or bookmark that page or send as many requests as they like to that particular page and not have to worry about duplicate transactions. So that's the pattern that we want to follow here. When I click create and I successfully save this restaurant, I then want to redirect and get a different resource that can show the user that they have successfully saved that restaurant. That's another important piece of the user experience too. Let's jump over into Visual Studio and see how to achieve that. So back in the restaurants controller, inside of the create action that takes an HTTP post, if the model state is valid and I have saved the restaurant into my data source, I no longer want to return the create view. Instead, I want to return a response that tells the browser to redirect to some other resource. So what I could do is use the redirect to action helper method that produces an action result that encapsulates an HTTP redirect. And I could say, well, let's redirect to the index action. That would take the user to the list of all restaurants. That could be helpful, but what if I went to the details for that specific restaurant that I just added into the collection? I think that would be more interesting. So we add a restaurant to the data source. Now I'm going to send you over to the page that shows you the details for that restaurant so you can see it lives inside of the data source. But of course, the details action requires an ID parameter. So this will not be a compiler error, but at runtime, the MVC framework won't have a value to place into the ID parameter. But you'll notice there's additional parameters that I can pass to the redirect to action helper method. And one of those parameters will be route values. So anytime you see something described as route values, you can use this trick where you pass an anonymously typed object whose properties and their values represent the information that you want to pass along in the route somehow. So that information might need to be passed in the query string, or it might appear in a segment of the URL. The MVC framework will figure out where to place it, but it will be passed along. So I want to create a new object with an ID property and set the ID property value to the ID of the restaurant that we just inserted into the data source. So the MVC framework should be smart enough to say, oh, you want to go to the details action and you want to pass along something called ID with this value, be it a 3 or a 4 or a 5. I can see where ID fits into the URL. So let me create a URL and redirect the browser to /restaurants/details/15 or whatever it is that we just created. Let's try this out. I'm going to do a build and come back to our browser. And let's start things off fresh by just going and issuing a GET request to /restaurants/create and have a fresh new copy of the form. And now let me create a restaurant whose name is Another Restaurant Part 2. We'll set the type of food to be French. I'm going to click create, and now I'm on the details for that restaurant. So I got redirected to /restaurant/details/4, and now I'm pretty confident as a user that I have saved that restaurant. But even if I'm not, if I click refresh, I don't have any warnings popping up in the browser that I need to resend information, and that might cause a problem. I don't have to worry about that. I can refresh this page. I can bookmark this page. Everything appears to be working. I can also go to the list of all the restaurants. I can see that restaurant appears here, even though we've lost the other restaurants, because again, it's an in-memory list, and my application got reset when I rebuilt the project. We'll fix that in the next module, but for now, let's take a look at the edit scenario. After everything you've seen, I think you might be able to implement the edit scenario on your own. I think you should try it now. I'm going to show you my solution, but I think it would be a good idea to try it on your own, even if you don't complete implementing the edit feature. It will give you some great experience to just try implementing this feature. So feel free to pause the video at this point and come back in when you've finished or you feel like you've gotten stuck and can't make it any further. Here's what I'm going to do. Over in Visual Studio, I'm going to go into my restaurants controller, and really the edit scenario and the create scenario are very similar. In fact, in a lot of applications, teams will implement edit and create using the same pair of actions. We're going to use some separate actions, but notice that the application is already set up so that if I try to edit another restaurant too, that's going to go to /restaurant/edit/4, so it's depending on an edit action being in place. So first, let's write the action that will return the form to edit a given restaurant. I will say this action only responds to HTTP GET. It's going to be a public method that returns an action result. Its name is going to be edit, and edit is slightly different than create because in the edit scenario, I need the identifier for an existing restaurant because I want to display that existing restaurant in a form so the user can change this restaurant. So that's something that's a little bit different. So I need to query for a model, and I can use my data layer to say, please go out and get a restaurant that has this ID. Just like with details, that could return a null. So I should check if model is null. If so, what would I like to do? Well, I could return an error, an HTTP not found error that would return an HTTP status code 404. Or we could do something like we did in details, which is if we did not find a specific restaurant, we'd just return a special view, the not found view. Either one of those options is reasonable. You just have to figure out what you need for your application and for your users. But if we do find the restaurant, let's return an edit view that will display that restaurant as the model. Let's go ahead and scaffold that view. So I'm going to right click in the method, say that I want to add a view. This view is going to be named edit. The template is going to be the edit template. The model class will be, again, a restaurant, and I will just click add to create that view. Like the views we've scaffolded so far, we will not have the ability to edit the cuisine of a restaurant. So like we did previously for the create feature, I'm going to copy this form group that allows me to edit the restaurant name. I'm going to copy that bit of markup and I'm going to paste it here into the form, and I'm going to modify the markup that I paste so that I can edit the restaurant cuisine. And again, just like we did in the create scenario, instead of asking for an editor for the cuisine, I'm going to specifically ask for an enum drop-down list for model.cuisine. What we're going to discover is that this HTML helper is also smart enough to set the initial selection in this HTML select to match the current value of the restaurant's cuisine. So this should behave the way you would expect. And so my view is in place. Let's just do a quick test to see if this part is working so far. I'm going to do a build in the project, come back to the application, go back to my list of all restaurants, just to make sure that after the data source resets, I still have a collection of restaurants that I can go to edit. And if I go to try to edit Mango Grove, I can see I'm on /restaurant/edit/3. And I do see the name of this restaurant and the type of food is correctly selected. So far so good. Now I just need to implement what happens when I click the save button and I post this information back to /restaurants/edit/3. So inside of the restaurants controller, let's create an action that will work for us. So an action that only responds to HTTP post, an action that will validate an anti-forgery token, and let's create an action that will return an action result. It is named edit, and as a parameter, we will take the restaurant. The first thing we will check inside of this action is we will check to see if model state is valid. Because if model state is not valid, I'm going to return the current edit view with this restaurant and allow the user to try to fix the model validation errors. I will only do that if model state is not valid. Otherwise, if model state is valid, I want to save this updated restaurant information. And just like we did with create, we can then redirect to an action, which is the details action. And we can pass along the ID of the restaurant. So the details action will have all the information necessary to pull that restaurant up for display. But how do we save a restaurant? Well, we don't have that implemented yet, but with an in-memory data source, that should be relatively easy. Let's open up our iRestaurant data and add a method that will allow me to update a restaurant. So you pass in a restaurant, I will find a restaurant with the same ID in my list of restaurants, and I will update the data inside. That's at least what we'll do for the in-memory restaurant data. When we're working with a database, something different might happen, but let's add a public method that returns void. Its name is edit. It takes a restaurant parameter, and let's find the existing restaurant. I could do that simply by going to my get method, passing along restaurant.id. That will either give me back a restaurant that has the matching ID, or it will give me back a null. So we could say if existing is not equal to null, only then do I want to try to copy some values in here. Otherwise, we could throw an exception, or we could just ignore this operation. We could also return some sort of status code or Boolean or even a restaurant object itself so that the controller knows that something wasn't found. That would probably be a good idea, but let's just go ahead with the logic that we have. And I'm just going to say that existing.name equals the incoming restaurant name. And we will say that the existing cuisine equals the incoming restaurant cuisine. And of course, we won't try to change the ID. Let me save that file, and with the edit operation in place, let me come back to restaurants controller and just say db.edit, or rather db.update. And sorry, we didn't want to call this edit, we wanted to call this update, and that should match the name that I provided in my interface. Yes, update here, also update in the implementation. That will make the compiler happy, and then over in the controller action itself, we call db.update, and we pass in the restaurant that was put together by the model binder. And I think the code that we have in place will work, so let me do a build. We'll come back out to the application. Let's go to the list of all restaurant. Let's go to edit Scott's Pizza, and let's just change the type of food from Italian to Indian. Click Save. That appears to have been persisted. If I come back to the list of all restaurants and go to the details for Scott's Pizza, it still says Indian, so it appears my edit feature works. I should also be able to change the name of the restaurant, so I'll change the cuisine back to Italian, change the name to Scott's Pizza 2, and all of these changes appear to be persisted in our data source, at least our in-memory data source. And now, what we've seen in this module really represents the bulk of what happens inside of a lot of MVC applications that I've seen over the years. We have actions that present forms to our customers. Our customers fill out information in those forms. They click a button to post back to our application. We validate the data that they post, and then ultimately we save that data inside of some sort of data source and display validation errors if there was a problem. We always validate anti-forgery tokens, and we follow the post redirect get pattern. This is all what we've seen in this module, which is a lot of the day-to-day work that we do with the MVC framework. So now that we have some basic core features in place, let's get the application working with a real database, a SQL Server database.